Hi there and welcome to the channel, and to this part 10 of my grand bookshelf tour. You'll find the 9 previous installments in the playlist, and in this part I'm going to focus on my unfiled Oxford World Classics and Penguin 20th Century Classics, those being the ones with the blue spine. So without further ado, let's begin. And first up we have St. Augustine's Confessions. Now you don't have to be religiously minded to enjoy the work of St. Augustine. I'm a third of the way through his City of God right now, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And in this book, you get 2 notable chapters. One where he gives his account of how he acquired language, and for many centuries, this was considered very much the case of how we do acquire language until it was finally conclusively debunked in the 20th century by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And there's also a notable chapter on how memory works. Thoroughly recommended. And then another book titled Confessions, this time those of Rousseau, and this is one of my favourite books, period, in any genre, and I've read it cover to cover 5 or 6 times, always with the same enjoyment. It begins with Rousseau as a boy in Geneva. He's apprenticed to a watchmaker, and one evening he arrives back to the city late and the gates are already shut, and rather than hang around and receive another beating from his master, he strikes out on his own across Europe. And his travels eventually carry him to France, where he rises to the top of the society and indeed becomes the foremost intellectual of the age and a close friend of the king. And then, unfortunately, in the latter period of his life, he becomes increasingly paranoid and ends up a broken man living alone. So it's rather heartbreaking, the final 100 pages or so. But what comes before that is simply magnificent, so highly recommended. Next, this is something of a curiosity. It's an anthology of Elizabethan prose fiction, and what's most notable here is Thomas Nash's The Unfortunate Traveller, which is one of the earliest examples of the picaresque in English and was quite influential actually upon William S. Burroughs. So if you're into Burroughs, you might enjoy going back and reading where it all began. And similar to this, there's also this Everyman, Italian Tales from the Age of Shakespeare. This is actually better than this one. And what you have here are English renderings of Tales from Italian, including from the Decameron by Boccaccio. And there's just so much energy in here. Yes, so much vitality that I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Then some realism from the Victorian period. It's Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. I have to admit, getting through the first few chapters, or indeed the first 100 pages of these realist novels, is always a great struggle for me. But if you can do that and get into the meat of the story, then they tend to take off and become rather interesting. But with this one, no, haven't made it through the first 2 chapters, where you're learning in pretty much anthropological detail every aspect of their living quarters, their relationships, their socioeconomic status, what they eat for breakfast, lunch and dinner. Yeah, it's really difficult to make much headway, but maybe we'll give it a try later this year. Then drama, Sophocles, Antigone, Oedipus the King and Electra. And of these I've read Antigone, and I did so in the company of an extremely surly Greek professor who was difficult to approach as a man, but he really did know his stuff, and he made it such a valuable experience going through this play in his company. Yes, so Antigone, wonderful. We'll get to the rest in due course. Next up, biography, autobiography, and it is Jack London's John Barleycorn. Now, if you're into Jack London and you haven't read John Barleycorn, you must, because it's absolutely sensational as a piece of life writing. And I particularly enjoyed the early chapter where he's becoming the king of the oyster pirates. Just wonderful. And if you haven't read any Jack London, then it's time to do so. Perhaps 2025 will be the year when you give him a try, because without doubt, he's one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And this is one of his best works. Okay, next, another great writer. It is Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian playwright. And here we have 4 major plays: A Doll's House, Ghosts, Hedda Gabler, and The Master Builder. It doesn't include The Wild Duck, which is the only one I've read so far. I read that just a month or so ago, and it was brilliant. A tangled tale of two families, and in one of these families, the young son hates his father and so attempts to reveal his secrets, and in so doing destroys the life of the head of the other family. A very tangled tale, as I say, but thoroughly enjoyable and extremely intense. So we'll get to those two later. Next, William Hazlitt selected writings. These are essays by a man who is considered one of the greatest stylists in the English language, and I'm just going to read you a little bit of the start of my favourite essay from this. It's The Indian Jugglers. Coming forward and seating himself on the ground in his white dress and tightened turban, the chief of the Indian jugglers begins with tossing up 2 brass balls, which is what any of us could do, and concludes with keeping up 4 at the same time, which is what none of us could do to save our lives, nor if we were to take our whole lives to do it in. Is it then a trifling power we see at work, or is it not something next to miraculous? It is the utmost stretch of human ingenuity, which nothing but the bending the faculties of body and mind to it from the tenderest infancy, with incessant, ever anxious application up to manhood, can accomplish or make even a slight approach to. Man, thou art a wonderful animal, and thy ways past finding out. Thou canst do strange things, but thou turnest them to little account. Great writing, I'm sure you'll agree. I just love William Hazlitt's intricate sentences. Okay, moving on, we have Lewis Carroll with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. I haven't read this for many years, but last semester with my Taiwanese students, I introduced them to the pleasures of the Jabberwocky, and they just thrilled to the crazy vocabulary, and they kept asking me, teacher, do these words really mean nothing? I'd say, yes, that's right. They're just there for their sound value. The Vorpal blade went snicker snack and all the rest of it. Great fun. Moving on, we have French drama. It is Molière's Don Juan or Don Juan, as I believe it's permissible to pronounce the interminable Byron poem of the same name, so maybe applicable here too. And we have some more plays, and the best known of them would be The Miser. Haven't read any of this yet. Hopefully I'll get to it in due course. Then more French writing. Alexandre Dumas, The Three Musketeers, a real doorstop. I have The Count of Monte Cristo somewhere on the shelves too. I haven't got round to reading that either, but I do know that Dumas was a great admirer of Walter Scott, so I'm hoping that some of Scott's genius has rubbed off upon Dumas, and one day, I promise, I'll get round to reading that. Next up is Jane Austen, my nemesis. I've read 3 of her novels so far, the best of which by far was Northanger Abbey, and then I read Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion, and I am not persuaded that Jane Austen is a very good novelist, but I'll get round to reading this in due course. I think there are 5 or 6 more editions floating around somewhere in this room. Okay, we may see some of them later. Then Melville's Moby Dick, and it doesn't matter how many times I've set out to read this, always with the best of intentions, let it be said, I just haven't made it past chapter 1. It's a very, very difficult text. If you've read all of it, you have my lasting admiration, because for me, no, this is one of the most difficult novels I've ever picked up. Oh, there's a piece of paper in there for no particular reason. Okay, next, this one I know very little about. It's Mary Hayes with her Memoirs of Emma Courtney. And I'll just read you the blurb. Emma Courtney is a passionate young woman who questions conventional attitudes by ardently pursuing the man she loves. The Memoirs is one of the most articulate expressions of the frustrations of a woman confined by society's expectations of appropriate conduct and behaviour in love and marriage. And this is from the 18th century. It really does look terribly interesting. Then, going back centuries earlier, we have Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and this is an English translation by David Wright. And I've got a bunch of these English translations because I also have one of the biggest books I've got in this room. I also have the Riverside Chaucer, which gives you all of Chaucer's work in the original Middle English, and so you do need some modern translations sort of on standby to supplement what you'll find in here. So if you're into Chaucer, as I am, you really do need to get hold of a copy of this. The only downsides to this book is, as you may guess, the text is tiny. so you'll need the reading glasses, and they haven't really left enough of a margin for writing notes, but otherwise a must-have. And next up we have more French writing, and it is Charles Baudelaire with his The Flowers of Evil. And this is excellent because, unlike many Oxford World's Classics, you have a side-by-side translation here. And I'm just going to find a very good poem from here, very short, The Albatross, and read it to you. Often when bored, the sailors of the crew trap albatross, the great birds of the seas, mild travellers escorting in the blue, ships gliding on the ocean's mysteries. And when the sailors have them on the planks, hurt and distraught, these kings of all outdoors, piteously let trail along their flanks, their great white wings, dragging like useless oars. This voyager, how comical and weak, once handsome, how unseemly and inept. One sailor pokes a pipe into his beak, another mocks the flyer's hobbled step. The poet is a kinsman in the clouds, who scoffs at archers, loves a stormy day, but on the ground, among the hooting crowds, he cannot walk, his wings are in the way. A great poem, I'm sure you'll agree, and I've just noticed another Byron association here because the cover of this edition of The Flowers of Evil is The Death of Sardanapalus by Delacroix, and of course Byron wrote a long poem about the death of Sardanapalus. Okay, moving on, we have Gogol with his plays and Petersburg Tales, and I've read some of the short stories here, among them The Nose, The Overcoat and Diary of a Madman, an excellent writer. His Dead Souls was one of the first great novels I read as a teenager, way back when, in the late 1980s. Then Joseph Conrad with his Heart of Darkness, not my favourite Conrad novel by any means. I much prefer Under Western Eyes or Lord Jim, or indeed The Shadow Line. I've reviewed a couple for the channel, so I'll put the links to them in this video description, but Heart of Darkness, essential reading if you're studying post-colonialism. Then another edition, as promised, of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. A different picture adorns the cover, and it has an introduction by Isabel Armstrong as opposed to the other one, which was penned by another person. Then Cervantes with his Don Quixote de la Mancha. I've got this edition, and also this one's translated by Charles Jarvis, yes, and I've also got the one translated by Tobias Smollett, or Smollett, as I know some people like to pronounce it. I haven't read this in truth either, but one day I will settle down. I'll need a couple of weeks or so and get through that. Then we have Goethe, Faust Part 1, and amazingly, in the used bookstore, I managed to find at the same time Faust Part 2. That doesn't often happen, does it? Haven't read any of those either. Only recently purchased those. Then Joseph Conrad, The Shadow Line. This was just excellent. A very slim novel and quite creepy, actually. Yeah, excellent. I did review that. Review 29. Shakespeare's As You Like It. I have this in the Arden Shakespeare too, and I've read about half of it. Of course, we all know it contains the All the World's a Stage speech at the end. Yeah, beautiful. This one has a few too many notes in it for my taste. I didn't notice that. Then one of my favourite novels of all, Robinson Crusoe, published in the early 18th century. And this is just magnificent. If you've never read it, I really suggest you do so. It's just superb. And finally, for this little stack, we have another Elizabeth Gaskell, and this time it's Mary Barton. And I've read, as with North and South, the first 30 or so pages and then just kind of stopped and thought, no, I just don't have the time to put into this at the moment, this realist writing, and I'm just not engaged sufficiently. There's just other stuff I want to read first, but who knows, maybe one day. We have a kind of meeting of the ownership class and the workers there on the cover. I do like that picture. Okay, moving on to the next stack. More children's writing, actually. Kenneth Grahame, The Wind in the Willows, and this is absolutely superb, and I would suggest getting an edition like this, which is unabridged, because you don't always get the chapter, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, because nothing much happens in it, but actually it's a superb example of nature writing. Yes, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, that is just superb. Non-fiction now, and it's William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. This is more on the shelf for the purposes of referring to rather than reading all the way through. It does get mentioned quite a lot in my anthropology books, for example. Then William Morris, the great 19th century artist. This is difficult reading, actually. It's supposed to be all about his socialism, but it's never quite grabbed me. So I have to give it another try at some point. I love his designs, though. His acanthus wallpaper, a firm favourite. Then American writing. We haven't had many offerings from American writers so far, have we? But this is Nathaniel Hawthorne with his the famous Scarlet Letter, the letter A, whose significance changes over the course of the text. Then French writing, Flaubert, Madame Bovary. I haven't read this either, which is kind of amazing, actually, when one considers how many novels I have read, and this is considered one of the greatest examples. I've read Bouvard and Pécuchet by Flaubert, which is excellent, but no, I've never gotten into this one. Then Russian writing, it's Turgenev with his Fathers and Sons. I've read some of this, but I read First Love rather than this one, resolving to return to this later. And First Love was absolutely brilliant, and I must get round to doing a review of that for the channel. Then, another edition of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Are they identical? Well, yes, they are. Okay, nothing more to say on that subject. Then Jonathan Swift with his Gulliver's Travels. I've often read this in an abridged version for children with students, and they always respond very positively to the weird adventures that feature in this novel. A great piece of writing. And next we have poetry. It's Tennyson, the major works. I have some more Tennyson collections over there. Great photograph of Alfred there. And I particularly enjoyed The Lotus Eaters. Yes, that was probably my favourite in here. And the Arthurian legend, Idylls of the King, that we also have. The Death of Wellington, no, not so much. And finally, for the Oxford World Classics, we have Henry James, The Bostonians. And I haven't read a single page of this one as yet. What have I read of James? Daisy Miller, So-So, The Aspern Papers, that was brilliant. And The Turn of the Screw, yes, that is also an excellent ghost story. But that is it for my Oxford World Classics. And in a moment, we'll proceed with the Penguin 20th Century Classics with their blue spines. Okay, so let's have part 2, and we begin with Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, a superb children's novel. You don't have to be a child to enjoy this. This book truly refreshes the spirit like few other novels I've read. Every now and again, I'll go back to it and read it again, just to remind myself about what is important in life, what is important in literature, because this is pure magic. I reviewed this for the channel along with Little Lord Fauntleroy and A Little Princess, which are not as good in truth, but this is one of the greatest children's novels ever written. Then another book I reviewed for the channel, it's Catherine Mansfield in a German Pension, a very slim volume of her short stories, and for me, her best short stories are in this collection. Then another book I reviewed for the channel, Reviews 3, Boy, a brutal tale of a boy who stows away on a ship and is then brutalized by the crew and then dies just as a teenager. And this was written by a writer who takes his vocation extremely seriously. And this novel, in fact, was so controversial, it cast a shadow over the career of James Hanley. Can't recommend this enough. Boy. Then another controversial book, it's Edmund Goss, Father and Son, which was a very candid look at the relationship between a Victorian child and his father. It was published anonymously, and the actual name of the author was only appended later, and Goss was a relation of Evelyn Waugh. Bit of trivia for you there. Then Andre Malraux with Man's Estate, set in China, and I really don't know much more about this. Set in China in 1927, it says on the back. Next, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. Not my favourite work by Hesse. I would take Demian or Narcissus and Goldmund or The Glass Bead Game over this. Yeah, but slim. If you want to read it in a few hours. Then this next novel is absolutely terrible. It's been down so long it looks like Up to Me by Richard Farina. And I guess part of the mystique of this novel is that unfortunately Flaminia died shortly before it was published, and so he never got to enjoy any success as a writer. And this is just sub-Joycean stuff. It's like Joyce meets Animal House, and it's pretty misogynistic too, it has to be said. No, everything about this is awful. It's nowhere near as clever as it believes itself to be. Then Edith Wharton, The House of Mirth. I haven't read any of this, but I did read some of her short stories in the collection Roman Fever, and she's undoubtedly a great writer. I also read Ethan Frome, which wasn't that great in truth. I'll get round to this one day. I do like this very dark picture on the front. That is rather moody. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. It was actually Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men which first got me into literature. That is the first serious work I ever read. We had a box of books given to us when I was about 12 years old, and in there was an old copy of Mice and Men, and that just took my reading to another level, because prior to that point I'd been reading stuff like the Robin Hood Adventures and Enid Blyton's Tales, The Secret Seven, The Famous Five. But then suddenly I read Of Mice and Men, and that opened the door to a new world. So I'll always be grateful to John Steinbeck. I know this is a tremendous novel, but I myself have not got round to reading it yet. Then, I do like this cover. It's a version of D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's Lover. I say a version because I've got numerous editions of this which present the manuscript at different points in its production. And who is that picture by? I need to have a look. The Creation of Eve by Mark Gertler in a private collection. And let me show you that again. It looks a little Blakean, that figure at the back. That's why I found that rather arresting. Oh, excuse me. Next up we have Truman Capote with Breakfast at Tiffany's. I've read the first 20 or so pages. You may notice a theme here, that the disappointed man usually does read like the opening chapter or two of pretty much every book he buys. I do that and then just sort of make a judgment about them, about when I'll find my way, when I'll find time to read the whole thing. And what I can say from this is that the writing is incredibly crisp. Yes, incredibly fresh. What a great writer Truman Capote was. I've read his In Cold Blood, which was excellent too. So, Breakfast at Tiffany's, I understand it's a movie as well. Then another Conrad novel, Nostromo, one of his most difficult works, and I haven't got round to reading that yet. What's there on the cover? Great scene of people toiling. More D.H. Lawrence. So this is John Thomas and Lady Jane. Okay, I'm a big fan of Lawrence, actually. I make no apologies for that. I know his sexual politics are considered very idiosyncratic or even verboten at the present moment in time, so I probably won't be trying to teach him in the classroom, but as a writer, at his best, he's definitely out there on his own for me, as a writer who really captures the passions. Yes. And also his feeling for environment as well. One of my favourite moments in his novels is in Women in Love, where someone is swimming underwater in the dark in a lake, and it's just amazing. He really does give you that feeling. And even when a character washes his face with water, cold water, in Aaron's Rod, 1922 novel by Lawrence, which I strongly recommend, just this description of the way the water feels, Lawrence is very, very good at capturing those kinds of fleeting experiences. Then a brilliant novel by Chesterton, The Man Who Was Thursday. Sadly, he didn't write enough novels for my tastes, but he wrote two amazing ones, The Man Who Was Thursday and The Napoleon of Notting Hill, both highly recommended. Then Evelyn Waugh, I've already mentioned him a few times. This is his travelogue, 92 Days. He did quite a lot of travel writing. This one is amazing. It's a kind of anti-travel narrative where nothing happens for 92 days, apart from his donkey occasionally gets a stone caught in his hoof. But that just shows off how technically skilled Waugh is, because he can spin a great narrative out of the least promising materials. And so this was quite a read, actually. 92 Days. It's in South America, I seem to remember. More travel writing from Waugh, Labels, and he was extremely young when he put this together, and it's got an account of him flying And it's very interesting because flight at that time was quite a novelty, and his description of his first journey in an aeroplane is actually fascinating. And his writing about Gaudi's La Familia Sagrada in Barcelona is a superb piece of art appreciation. So this is a really good book. Labels by War. More D.H. Lawrence here. I just mentioned this. Women in Love, a very good novel. Beautiful. More Evelyn Waugh. It's Brideshead Revisited. Now I know there's a whole cult around this novel, and it is beautifully written, but it's definitely not my favourite Waugh novel. It rather left me cold in the second half, but the opening half, yeah, is amazing. Then I've already mentioned this one too. D.H. Lawrence, Aaron's Rod. Highly recommended. It's about a man, a working class man, who plays a musical instrument. I can't remember if it is the flute perhaps, but he's extremely skilled, and he decides to desert his wife and child and just follow his dream. And he finds himself in Italy and has a romance with a countess. But there's lots of beautiful descriptions of life in Italy, and that was a very enjoyable novel. Next we have W. Somerset Maugham with The Painted Veil, and this is a kind of oriental love story. I've only read the first 10 pages or so, but this one looks quite promising. And unlike his Of Human Bondage, this one's nice and short. Then more Evelyn Waugh, When the Going Was Good, and this rounds up some of his travel writing. So I think if you've got Labels and 92 Days, you don't actually need to buy this one. Great picture there on the front on a ship. Next, more Joseph Conrad. It's The Secret Agent. I read about half of this about 20 years ago, so I don't remember too much about it. But lots of intrigue. It's all about anarchists in London, isn't it? Yeah, it's considered one of his very best. Pretty much everything Conrad wrote is worth reading. There we are. And then H.G. Wells. Now, not everything H.G. Wells wrote is worth reading. He was far too prolific. And this one, A Short History of the World, was very influential at the time, but it's now been largely forgotten. I've reviewed 3 of his novels for the channel, reviews 30. They were The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. He is a good writer, actually, but you have to pick and choose what you're going to read. The Island of Dr. Moreau was also excellent. And finally, for this stack, we have another Conrad novel. It is Heart of Darkness. Haven't we already had that? Yes, I believe so. But I think this edition was a little cleaner than the other one. So there we are, Heart of Darkness. Let's move on to the final stack. And we have another Conrad novel, and it is Lord Jim, one of his very, very best. And this is full of magnificent Conradian sentences that you just don't find in the work of any other writer. This is him at his finest. Yes, I'd say of the Conrad novels I've read, this is the best. Okay, along with Under Western Eyes. Next, sociology. We have Thorstein Veblen with his The Theory of the Leisure Class. I've actually read this. I do read a lot of sociology. I think I had a 10-year period where I pretty much read nothing but sociology. And this one has great chapters on concepts that were coined by Veblen, but now we're still using, such as conspicuous consumption, conspicuous leisure. And one chapter I'd really recommend in here is the one on sabotage. That is superb. It turns on its head one's common sense understanding of economics. So this comes highly recommended. It also helps that he's a great writer as well. Can't be said of every sociologist, can it? Then George Douglas Brown, The House with the Green Shutters. He died at a tragically early age from his alcoholism, and this is the only novel he finished. But if he had lived, he would have been a major talent, and this is a superb novel. I did review it for the channel. This is one where I'd say, if you have the chance to seek it out, do so. Actually, this one's just worth going online and buying. It's a superb story set in a Scottish village, and it's a tragedy, basically. But the way it unfolds is just so painstakingly slow. It just goes into that final scene in such depth that you're torn apart by what happens. And the characterizations in here are just superb. It's so well-rounded. Just a really intelligent man, a finely educated man, producing a work of real substance. What a tragedy that he didn't just write 2 or 3 more great novels before he died, but he did leave us this one, thankfully. Yes, that final scene is just immense. Immense. Then E.M. Forster collected short stories. Having read more André Gide, I've come to the conclusion that E.M. Forster is a vastly inferior English Gide. Yes, and so I'm not terribly enamoured of his writing. And I seem to remember that the reason I picked this up was, one, it was very cheap, and two, I absolutely love the picture there, and I knew by sight it was painted by Roger Fry, and so that was why I picked it up. I have some other books by Roger Fry too. Then O. Henry selected stories. Now this is a staple, isn't it, of kind of English literature undergraduate programs, or at least it was like 20 or 30 years ago. It's just considered like one of the early masters of the American short story. I've probably read some of these in collections over the years. Then more W. Somerset Maugham. These are pretty good in truth. They're not always terribly exciting, and the writing is rather stodgy, but sometimes they are just basically good stories in that they're just interesting in terms of their content. And he seems to have overheard or interrogated people to get a hold of some of these stories. I seem to remember Maugham said something like, give me 30 minutes with someone and I'll pick their brains and find something in their experience that I can spin into a short story. And he did have that facility. And I seem to remember there was one really good one about some Dutch sailors, reporting some shenanigans they'd got up to on one of their ships concerning a woman. That stuck in my mind. Next, Karen Blixen or Isaac Dinesen and her Out of Africa. And I've read some of her other work. I haven't read this one. She gets rather criticized now by some of the post-colonial critics. They have a lot of problems with the nature of her writing. But one thing is for sure, she is a good writer. And there's a great picture on the front there too. Next up, an American writer, Charles W. Chestnut, The House Behind the Cedars. This is by an Afro-American writer. Yes, I seem to remember that. And it focuses on passing, which is this phenomenon during segregation in America where Black people with light skin would pass as members of the white community. So it's very interesting, and it's received more attention in recent years for that reason. Haven't read any of that one yet. Then Graham Greene, Journey Without Maps. And so, like Evelyn Waugh, he mixed his novel writing with travel writing, and he is just a great writer, period. I haven't read any of this yet, but we will get around to it. He also wrote the rather amusingly titled Travels with My Aunt, which I have somewhere here too. Now, absurdist drama. This has 4 short plays by Ionesco, Arthur Adamoff, Fernando Arrabal, and Edward Albee. And I've read 2 of these, and they were the Adamoff one. That was great. I have to say that was great. It also has an amazing picture on the cover. And I've also read Edward Albee, The Zoo Story, in another collection. That just has a very bizarre ending. But yes, the Adamoff one was the pick of those 2 stories. Carson McCullers, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I think there may be a movie of this. I haven't read any of this one either, but I would note that it has one of the best titles of a novel I think I've ever come across. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. That is just a beautiful line. I wonder if they coined that phrase or if it's taken from somewhere else. Then we have, yes, this is beautiful, Ronald Blythe, Aikenfield. This is some of the best writing about the English countryside. I think Ronald Blythe died not so long ago, and he really did make a great contribution to the writing about rural England, and I really did greatly enjoy this. Anything connected with Ronald Blythe is worth picking up. The only downside of this is the text is tiny. Great picture on the cover there too. Let me get the glasses and see who that's by. It's From Stoke by Nayland Church by Cedric Morris from 1940. I'll give you another look at that. Wonderful. Makes me wish I was back in the English countryside right now where I grew up. Then Australian writing. It is A Fringe of Leaves by Patrick White. I've only read the first chapter or so, which was quite promising. But I don't know much about this guy. I do know he has a very famous novel called Voss, which I've seen in a used bookstore here. And I should pick it up. Okay, so let's see what that is like when we get around to it. And then one I do know very, very well, it's Rudyard Kipling's Pook of Pook's Hill, one of my favorite children's books. And this is a linked series of tales, and the basic idea is pure genius. Two children find that there is a spirit, a fairy, in the field of the house where they live, Pook, and he has the ability to transport them back in time. So they go on these adventures through English history, meeting these great figures. And after each day's adventure, he makes them chew like some leaves from a tree. I think it's oak, ash, and thorn. And then they forget their adventure until the next time they go out. So it means the parents are unable to find out about what is going on. And the writing here is just brilliant. And even the poems that open each chapter are superb. Harp Song of the Dane Women. Okay, that is the Knights of the Joyous Venture. Oh, that is great because the picture on the cover is from that particular chapter, Knights of the Joyous Venture. So if you've never read this and you're at all interested in great children's writing or English history, this kills two birds with one stone. That is really superb. That and The Secret Garden, probably my two favorite children's books. Then Joseph Conrad, Under Western Eyes, review number 4 for the channel. This was superb. It's about Russian anarchists, and much of it is set, I believe, in Switzerland. And the quality of the writing is off the charts here. It's highly lyrical at times, and it also has a great story. It's magisterially paced, shall we put it like that? In that it's very brave, you know, it's so slow moving for the first maybe perhaps 200 pages, and then it just begins to develop this momentum, and it's brilliant. By the end, I was just completely floored by the power of Conrad's vision. It has a beautiful picture on the cover too. Almost there. I've also talked about this on the channel. I did a part 1 about Saki, the complete Saki, H.H. Munro, one of the best short story writers in the English language. He's an Edwardian, and the humour in these and the way they're written is so arch. If you like Oscar Wilde, you're going to absolutely love Saki. And there are some absolute classics in here, like The Open Window and The Unrest Cure. And there are a set of tales about animals that are really good as well. Okay, so it also has, again, a beautiful photo of Saki looking magnificent there. The last few, another great photo. It's D.H. Lawrence, The Prussian Officer and Other Stories. I've sung the praises of The Prussian Officer many times. It's about 60 pages long, and it's a kind of proto-queer short story about a Prussian officer and one of his men. And it is so intense. It's absolutely superb. One of the best short stories I've read in, 40 years of reading. I do recommend it very highly to you. And there's also a story with a similar atmosphere by Guy de Maupassant, The Olive Grove. So if you've read The Prussian Officer, go and read The Olive Grove and see how you feel the two compare. Then we have this one by Lawrence, 3 novellas. I've read this and they are all excellent. And I think the best of them was The Fox. Yeah, that was superb. It was like a Flannery O'Connor Southern Gothic story set in England. And I did absolutely love that. It was about a stranger. Of course, you always have the stranger wandering in, don't you? Whose past you're unaware of. And they do turn out to be that dangerous stranger who brings death in their wake. You know, it's like Catherine Ann Porter, Flannery O'Connor. Very good. And more short stories by Lawrence with a picture of the man himself adorning the cover. Then, oh dear, the one negative review I've done on the channel, The Death of the Heart by Elizabeth Bowen. And this was terrible. I know some people really do like her writing. It also featured an appalling picture by Gwen John. It's just completely washed out, isn't it? This novel was just abysmal. I still get comments on that video now saying, you're completely wrong about this, Jason, and this novel is really good. But equally, I'll get comments saying, you're absolutely right, Jason, this novel is truly appalling. I do have some more Elizabeth Bowen novels knocking around somewhere. If I ever feel in a kind of masochistic frame of mind, I might open one up, try reading it. Spy novel next. It is Len Deighton's $1 Billion Brain, and this was really enjoyable actually. The hard-boiled style mixed with a kind of upper class English humour, although Len Deighton himself was not upper class. He was a kind of social climber, and yeah, it was just so pithy, some of the writing here. And it featured this billionaire who was a mix of kind of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and he was trying to create this computer system, like an early AI, that would send out all the instructions to nefarious agents dotted around the world, who would then carry out their missions, and they would become synchronized by this central computer. Yeah, the plot was extremely difficult to follow, and actually had no idea by the end what was going on, but the writing itself was excellent. I'd like to read more Len Deighton. I always saw those books on the shelf of like my dad's generation when I was visiting homes when I was a child, and I always thought, oh dear, dad stuff, but actually it's much better than I ever would have believed. And finally, an absolute master to conclude this segment of the bookshelf tour. It is one of my favourites. It is Luigi Pirandello, with 6 Characters in Search of an Author and Other Plays. And the thing with Pirandello is he's not just about his plays, which are excellent. The short stories are superb, and he also wrote some excellent novels too. Everything this man touched turned to gold, and he is without doubt one of my absolute favourite writers. I haven't read these plays yet, but I have read almost all of his short stories, and they are among my favourites. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes this part of the bookshelf tour. If you've got anything to say about any of the books that I featured in this video, then please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. But for now, all that remains is for me to bid you farewell in the customary fashion. So until the next time, be safe, be strong, nanu nanu.